Hello! So, welcome to another release livestream, this time for lxd-423. This particular release was put out on Thursday and is actually starting to roll out to users right now. It's quite a busy release. We've got quite a few major features as well as a number of smaller additional configuration options and the like, on top of the usual dose of performance improvements and bug fixes that we usually get. So let's start by going through the release announcement itself. Just gonna look at the different highlights there before going into demo of all of those different things. The first thing was the replacement of lxd-p2c with lxd-migrate. lxd-p2c stood for physical to container, and so would let you stream a physical system's file system into a new container effectively. Now that lxd supports virtual machines, we wanted to redo that tool and add support for streaming virtual machines as well, but also give us a lot more flexibility and options as far as what's supported for things like authentication, overriding a variety of settings. It's really quite a bit more flexible now. The next bit that we're quite excited about is the implementation of token-based authentication. So up until now, when you wanted to add someone to a remote lxd server, your options were somewhat limited. You could have them generate their client certificate, send that through SSH or something to the target server, and then add that to the trust store using config trust add. That was the safest way of doing it, which, if combined with getting the server certificate through some kind of out-of-band main, was allowing to make sure that you are talking to the right server and that the client was trusted and never needing to have anything that could be brute forced, like a password. More realistically, what a lot of users would do instead was to set a lxd trust password, which would then let a client add itself to the remote server, so long as they knew the password. That's reasonably safe, so long as that password is quite strong and so long as you unset the password after the fact so that nobody can brute force it after the client actually joined. Many people wouldn't do that, and so that can expose lxd to potential brute force attacks, which is never ideal. With the token-based authentication, we're getting the same workflow as we've got with cluster add these days, where the administrator can say they want to add the user, give a name, they then get a long token string that can be passed to the client, and on the client this can be added with remote add. The token itself includes the server addresses, the server certificate, and a one-time secret that can be used to add the client to the server. So with those, it's a lot safer because you're not keeping the door open all the time. You can also apply specific restrictions, and all tokens become automatically invalid whenever lxd restarts. So it's quite ephemeral and really improves security. It will, as I said earlier, like it really works the same way as what we introduced for cluster a little while back. So if you're familiar with the cluster tokens and how they can be listed and revoked and all that kind of stuff, it works the exact same way here. Next feature is custom DNS records in network zones. So network zones have kind of grown in feature since we introduced them a few months ago. Effectively, what network zones are they are DNS zones, either forward or reverse, that you can add to a lxd project, and then you can tie those to specific networks, and then instances running on that network automatically get a forward and reverse DNS record. lxd then acts as a AXFR DNS server, which can have its zones transferred to an actual DNS server that can then serve that to normal recursive DNS clients. We added a few tweaks to that somewhat recently so that you could only export some specific records, for example, not exporting records if NAT is enabled. And now what we've got is support for arbitrary additional records to be added. So if you need to add, I don't know, a scene name, a text record, or even some straight A or quad A records, you can now do that through lxd, and that will get added to the zone that lxd then exports over XFR. The next feature, which should help quite a bit with support to an extent on our side, is the introduction of image requirements. So there are now some new image properties that are treated especially by lxd. If it sees, for example, requirements.cgroup equals v1, it knows that the VM can, that particular container can only run on a system which supports cgroup v1. If it's running on a system that lacks cgroup v1 and only has cgroup v2 or no cgroup support at all, it will show an error. That will help particularly these days as distributions are moving to cgroup 2 with older containers, thinking like CentOS 7, Ubuntu 16.04 and the like, just not working anymore on those platforms and causing quite a bit of confusion. So instead of starting but not working, now they just fail to start with a clear error, which should help quite a bit with the user to figure out what to do. We're using the same feature as well for virtual machines. We've had a number of virtual machine images that required secure boot to be disabled. So those VMs also have now their image annotated with that config option so that they fail similarly, effectively telling the user you need to turn off secure boot on this VM for it to work. The next feature is support for accessing the ACL log when dealing with oven networking. So when you've got an oven network and you're using network ACLs, one of the targets, I don't know what it's called exactly, but anyway, yeah, I think one of the targets effectively is logged. So you can choose whether a rule is enabled, disabled, or its traffic is logged. That log goes into an oven system log effectively. And up until now, the only way you could then look for those hits would be to connect to every single one of the server inside of the cluster and go look at the oven log and see, you know, is there a log entry that matches my ACL with my particular network and or instance. The problem with that is that not only does it take a while and you need to be an administrator on those systems to go and get that data, but there was also the issue of the log entries themselves not directly telling you what lxd ACL it was. It was all about database IDs and lxd internal identifiers. So now there's a clean API and CLI that lets you get a even machine parsable version of those logs for a specific ACL. So you can create an ACL, turn on logging, then do a show log on that particular ACL, and you'll get the log entries. Still related to Oven, we've also extended the network state API so that it does work with Oven now. So lxd network info works against an Oven network, and we've even added some Oven specific data in there that we're going to be exposing through the CLI in the near future. Again, network related, those using VLANs, we've supported VLAN.tagged for a while on our network interfaces, and that supported a comma separated list of VLANs. But for those dealing with a very large number of VLANs, having ranges instead is quite convenient. And so that's been added now, where you can do, as is in the example here, 10, 50, 1000 to 2000, and all of those VLANs will then be passed in. The next one is the server-side filtering of storage volumes. So when dealing with the lxd API, it can sometimes return quite a lot of data, which can be quite intensive on the server side to get all of those details. So now we've got support for API filtering on the storage volumes collection. We already had that on instances and images. It works the exact same way, lets you filter on specific properties. The CLI currently doesn't actually make use of that feature for any of those APIs, but it's used by some of our third-party users. We're also looking at probably adding that support in our CLI soon. Then we've got a few ZFS changes. So we've got zfs.export, which lets you turn off lxd's default behavior of exporting only ZFS pools that it fully owns. We also have support for ZFS reserve space, which makes it effectively has ZFS treat the instance as if it's using the entirety of its storage all the time, so that no other instance can effectively steal that storage away from it. It's particularly useful for high priority services that you never want to see run out of disk space by having that space fully reserved to them. Then we've got zfs.blocksize, which is primarily used when needing to tweak some specific IOs, so you can set the block size or the record size, depending on whether it's a container or VM, through that option, and then that gets set into ZFS, and any new write from that point on will respect that. And lastly, we've got a new option for the snapshot schedule, which is a simple @never keyword, which effectively allows disabling snapshots entirely on an instance. This is normally the default, but if you've got a profile that specifies a snapshot schedule, you need that config option to be able to stop that inheritance from the profile. All right, so that's it for all of the new stuff in lxd 4.23. I'm not going to be looking at them individually again, but as a demo. So let me switch over to a terminal. Oops, actually I forgot to clear that. Let me just do it. Okay. And the first one is lxd-migrate. So as a reminder, lxd-migrate is effectively a static binary. So I've got a build here. We can see that it's been built statically, so statically linked and not stripped. It's just a simple static binary that you can ship around. We also have it available directly as a GitHub artifact. So if you just need to download the pre-built copy, we have it available that way. Now, I'm in a test project here, and we can see I've got a container here running that's called C1. So what I'm going to be doing next is I'm going to transfer the lxd-migrate binary into C1, and then get a shell inside of C1. And what I want to do is effectively transfer that container as if it was a physical system into a new container on lxd. So I'm going to be running the lxd-migrate command. It actually reminds me that there is a dependency. The only thing it requires is rsync, so it needs to be installed in the on the system that you're transferring. Okay, then asks for the URL of the lxd server. So in this case, that's the one. Prompts for the fingerprint. All right. And then it's a lot more interactive than it used to be. So now it asks, how do we want to handle authentication? So we can use candid RBAC, we can use a certificate token. This feature is actually, this particular line I don't think shows up in actual 4.23. We merged it just after, but it's coming. And then we've got existing TLS certificate, if you've got one that was already created and trusted, or the most common option, I believe, is going to be number 4, generate a TLS certificate. So let's do that. That just generated a certificate, and now it tells me, like, go and add that to the trust store. So let's go into that. So I'm just creating a file, putting a certificate in, and then I do lxd-config trust add of that certificate. And we can see it's right here, added to the trust certificate, trust store. Now it asks whether we want to use a trust password. That's not recommended, but that's the old way. So if you didn't want to transfer it out of band and then trust it with config trust add as I did, you could use a trust password at that point. But I don't have one configured, so it will not actually work. Once it's been added, asks to press enter to validate. Okay. That shows that it managed to connect to lxd, what version it is, and what the name of the server is. And then it asks whether you want to create a container or virtual machine. For this demo, we're using a container. Then ask what project. So the project I'm currently in here is my demo project. So I'm going to do demo. We'll call the new instance C2, and then provide a path to the root file system. So if it's at your root or another container you've got somewhere, you would specify the path there. In this case, I want to suck in the entire instance, so I'm going to do /. Just like lxd P2C supported, you can also add additional mount points. So if you've got a system that's got multiple disks mounted, you'll need to specify all of them. So you might have to specify /home and /mount or whatever. So anywhere where you've got a mount point, you need to specify it. Given it's a container here, doesn't apply to me, so just keep it as no. Okay, then it shows a quick overview. It's like instance to be created, C2 in project demo, it's a container, and the source path is /. And then it asks whether I want to just transfer it, which is the default, or whether I want to do any overrides. So I can kind of show the overrides. So I could do additional config options, and then let's do limit CPU to, and we've got that applied. Guess we can do limits memory to a gig. Okay, and it gets added. You can change the profile list as well. Or you can change the storage pool. So say I'll do storage pool defaults. Do you want to change? Sure, I'll do a 20 gig. All right. And it shows that we've changed the storage pool to default and the volume size to 20 gig. The same can be done with the network, where I can do enter the network name, and then I change the network as well. So it shows you always like a nice summary of what's going to happen. And once you're done, you just hit enter to pick the default option, which then transfers the actual instance over. Give that a few seconds. I mean, obviously in this case, like I'm transferring a container onto the same host as that container. It's a bit silly. Normally you would not quite do that. You would do it from an actual system you want to decommission and move into a container. But for the demo's sake, that works well. And we can see here that C2 has been created. If I go look at its config, you can see it's got the 20 gig. It's got the limits in place and everything. And if I start it back up, it's starting and it's working. So that's for the container. We used to mostly be able to do that with lxd p2c. Not quite as many options as far as overrides and all that kind of stuff, but generally we were able to do that. Now, what gets a bit more interesting is that we can also do it with virtual machines. So here, as I said, I also have a VM called v1 that's currently running. So I'm gonna stop that VM. Okay. Then I'm gonna be doing, I'm gonna make its block device visible, which apparently I don't have in my history. So I want board mode dev on rpool xd. Going for memories and gonna work so well for me. Let me just find it. So it's v1 in demo. Okay. So I'm gonna be turning that ZFS volume into a visible block device. So doing that command means that I can now access so here demo v1 block. Okay. So that's a block device now. And that means I can run lxd-migrate again. Same thing as far as where the server is, that hasn't changed. This time I'm gonna do the candid RBAC authentication just to show you how that works. So if I do that, it gets me a link for authentication purposes, which then gets me there. So I'm just gonna authenticate. Okay, and we're connected. So I can just hide that now. There we go. This time I'm saying virtual machine. Project is still demo. Gonna call it v2. And please provide the path to a disk partition or disk image. So in this case, it's effectively a disk here. So passing that path. Does the VM support secure boot? Yes, it does. And we can see the override here that it makes sure secure boot is enabled. Shows it's gonna go in the right project and everything. We're not gonna be doing any overrides this time, but we definitely could if we wanted to. And when hitting enter, it's gonna do the same thing as before and transfer all of the data across. That's gonna be quite a bit larger because we're doing for virtual machine this time. So I believe the image size is probably around 5 gigs. So I'm expecting about 5 gig of network transfer here before it's fully transferred and it can be ready to start. So there's a few more seconds for that one. And come on. That's a bit larger than I expected. Is that VM 10 gig large, maybe? Yeah, it looks like it is. Oh, I think it's because the image is 5 gig when we generate it, but lxd default size for virtual machine is 10 gig. So it's going all the way to 10 gig. And because we're doing a raw disk transfer and not something more optimized, how much space you've used in there doesn't really matter. It all gets transferred. That being said, there's compression, so it's not the full waste. That's why we're transferring that fast. So that's the full size instant v2 successfully created. There we go. So if we look, v1, v2 now. I should be able to start v2. Give it a few seconds to start up. And then it should be able to get a shell in there. So let's see. v2, and here we go. It even shows it's called v1 inside of the guest because, well, that's what it was called on the source. Okay, so that's for lxd-migrate. That's the new workflow. It's a lot more interactive, supports a lot more features, and will also make it significantly easier for us to expand by not having to constantly add more and more command line arguments. It was getting a bit out of control. So having just that one nice command with a kind of more menu-based and showing the overview and everything before the transfer, I think it's a lot more user-friendly. Now for the next bit, which is the token-based authentication. So I'm gonna get into another VM here that's called ZFS. This one has lxd in it, so lxd 423. It doesn't have any instance or anything. And if we look at its config, it doesn't have anything configured. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna have it listen on the network. So that's, now it's listening on port 8443. And with that done, now I would like to add it to my my desktop here and be able to connect to it. So in the old days, I would either transfer a certificate and add that and then make it work, or do a trust password and then do remote add and then compare the certificate and make sure everything is fine. But now what I can do is just do lxd-config trust add, enter a name, let's call it Kara, that gets me that token. And all I've got to do here is remote add ZFS and give the token. And that's it. That just told everything that the command line needed to connect to the server, validate the certificate, and then add itself to the trust store. And if we look here, the certificate for my client got automatically added to the trust store. So that works quite nicely. Now for something we couldn't do before, well, at least not easily. So if I remove my entry from the trust store here, and I remove that remote from my client, and here I'm going to create a new project. So just create a project called foo. And now I'm going to do a trust add again, but this time I'm going to pass restricted projects foo. And again, put the car and then use that token. Okay. And now if I go look at the project list on that remote, I can only see foo. So that lets you actually create potentially like per user restricted project or something like that, and then give them effectively an invite, which is the token. They can just add through lxd remote add, and that will get them access to just that one project. So you can, it's really quite flexible. It's a much better workflow. All right, just clean that up. Cool, and I can also remove it from here for good measure. All right, so next up, the next one would be the DNS records. So custom DNS records, I've got that set up on a remote cluster. So I'm going to be listing just the network zones that are available on that remote cluster here. You can see one. And if I do a show on that zone, we can see it's set up so to not export NAT records, and that my client here is allowed to transfer that zone. I can in fact do that right now if I use this command. So it's using dig against my remote server on some fixed port and does an EXFR transfer of the zone. And here we go, get all the IPs from that zone. So far, nothing new. That was already supported in 422. Now, the new thing is I can list, well, I'll start by listing any custom record. So lxd network zone record list, that's a new command, followed by the zone name. It shows there's nothing in there. But now let's create one called foo. So foo is now showing up with no entries. And let's say we want to make foo a text record that just says blah. So this is adding with the rather long lxd network zone record entry add the zone itself, followed by the name of the record, which is foo, the type of the entry for that record, which is text, and then a value, which is blah. The reason for that structure is that you can have multiple values. So you could have both blah and bar. And if you do list, you see both of those are set on there. And if I do the zone transfer again, this time I look for full, we'll see that in the zone, we've got now those two records. And then to undo it, you just do the reverse with move, blah, blah, oops, blah. And then the record itself can be deleted. And it's all going to be gone. So that's the custom DNS records within network zones. Next, image requirements. So as I mentioned, that's mostly to catch cases where like a given instance, container or virtual machine image won't work on a particular system. And I can show you with two different things. The first one that we've seen quite regularly lately is running CentOS 7 on a system that does not support cgroup 1. That's the case of my own system. It's running cgroup v2. And now if I try to do that launch, right after when it tries to start the container, it fails with the image used by this instance requires a cgroup v1 host system. There's not a ton you can do at that point. The main thing you could do is change your grub configuration to disable cgroup v2, then reboot your system and then start that instance and it will start up. It's not failing the creation itself, it's failing the startup. That's so that if you create some instances, they work properly and then you reboot into a kernel which won't work anymore, then that check will kick in and will let you know what's going on. So I'm just gonna delete it. There we go. And to show the same thing with virtual machines, in this case, I'm going to be using an Alpine image, which does not support SecureBoot. So it shows the image used by this instance is incompatible with SecureBoot. In the case of this error, it's something you can fix immediately. Like you can say, okay, I don't mind with not having SecureBoot. I'm just going to turn it off. So you set security SecureBoot to false on that particular instance, and then it will start up just fine. So that's really what we're using the image requirements for right now. We're gonna probably be expanding that as we need in the future, but it's working quite well. You can even use it on your own images by setting those properties. All right, next one is the ACL logs. So ACL logs, in this case, still using my remote cluster, I'm gonna show an existing ACL called Unify in a project. And that's quite a long ACL, but what we can look at is that last entry here. So that last access control entry shows action reject TCP on port 22 and logged. So that means that anyone trying to SSH to that particular IPv4 or IPv6 address or that particular instance effectively will be rejected and the traffic will be logged. In the past, you'd need to SSH into the different servers, look at the logs and try and figure out what's going on, who's trying to connect, etc. It wasn't super good. These days, what you do is this. You just do network ACL, show log. So instead of showing the ACL, you do show log, then the ACL name. And what you get is this. So that's a log sorted by timestamps. That shows at the bottom here, we've got the most recent attempt. We can see the IP address that tried to connect to it, what IP address they connected to, what source port they used, destination port was 22. It also confirms that the action ended up being rejected. And that's what you get. Just something worth noting is that we're parsing the current log from Oven. So if the log gets rotated, that data will end up being missing. And similarly, Oven itself only does kind of best effort as far as writing those log entries in the first place. So if you've got a very loaded system, you might be missing some of them. So you shouldn't rely on that having every single hit, but to just see abnormal patterns or something, it will work just fine and will get you a very useful log. All right. Next one is the network state for Oven. So the simplest way I can show it is again using that remote cluster. So let's just do network info. So this works. It didn't used to. So now you can do like network info on another network. It shows you the MAC address correctly. It shows you the IPv4, IPv6 address. That's all good. The network usage, we don't actually get that data, so it's showing all zeros. And we've got a bit more data that's not currently showed. So if you do debug, and you look at what's actually being transferred, in the case of Oven, we've got a bit of extra metadata here, which tells us which of the servers is the current active chassis for that Oven network. So in the case of my cluster, I've got 3 servers here. And in this case, it tells me that this particular network is being handled currently by Orilla, which is the 3rd server. That can be quite useful if you need to like debug some network traffic issue. You can use that. Again, this field is not directly exposed by LXC network info right now, but we're going to be adding it very soon. Next one. So the next feature we're going to be looking at here is the VLAN ranges. All right. So I don't really have a good demo for that one because I don't have a setup here where I can just show those VLANs, but I should be able to just do it on a plain old instance. It will accept the config, just won't do anything super useful. So I should be able to do lxd-config edit, lxd-config edit of say C2, and right, so we're just going to be switching that to, actually no, let's go to bridged parent, good. So let's just do VLAN.tagged. So in the past, this should work fine. What did I mess up? Oops. That used to be bridged, there we go. Okay, so this works fine, that's the old syntax. You can do VLAN 1 and 2 as tagged. Now you can do a range as well. And that's really all that it is. It's much more compact syntax, especially when you're dealing with, I mean, in this case, it was 1,000 VLANs. That would be very unpleasant to write down. Now you can do a range. Next one would be the server-side filtering of storage volumes. That one, I might need to just look up a quick example for the API because I've not actually done it in a little while. But in the recent announcement, there's a link to the filtering documentation, which is what I'm actually loading up right now. I can actually show you what I'm doing here. So filtering, it's just, okay, question mark, filter equals, field name, and then EQ desired value. Okay, so let's try that. So if we do storage pools, default, volumes. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with. Now, I know there's at least a filter to turn off the snapshot, so we can try that. So question mark, filter equals, and it needs to contain spaces. That's what snapshots equals. Not quite. It might also be the escaping. That's not actually working so well. Let's try by name. Nope, by the request. Just relook at the doc. It's quite possible that the issue is it's just with the yeah, this should actually have worked. Oh, okay, it needs to be escaped. Okay. Let me try again. So if I do that, I suspect I'm gonna hit some escaping issues actually. Yeah, most certainly. What's the query being sent? Filters name. Okay, I mean that actually looks plausible. But I'm pretty sure it's the lxd query that's messing with me. Because this should have worked just fine. Just rechecking the examples, but yeah, I think it's a case of it's not the feature having a problem because it's the exact same logic we have for for instances and for images. I think it's the tool I'm using. I said that's primarily used by third-party developers that can do proper URL encoding and whatnot, and I suspect I'm missing something here. Because I promise you deal like spaces and escaping and stuff like this won't go through, obviously. If I pass in the old thing as a string, that probably won't quite do what I want either. Yeah. All right. So sorry, I can't really demo that one. But yeah, it is not possible to use the API filtering. It's just recommended to do it from an actual client, not by just trying to do it through curl or something like that, because the escaping for those kind of filters that include spaces and that includes quotation becomes a bit tricky. All right, so let's get on to the next one. And the next ones, actually, like the next three, are all ZFS related. So I'm gonna go into that VM. It currently doesn't have anything running, but it is using a ZFS pool. So the first thing I'll do is just install the ZFS tools here. And I don't want to spend too long, so I'm just gonna not install the recommends. There we go. And what I want to do here is just show that the pool is currently available. So we can see the pool exists. And now if I completely stop lxd, I would expect it to go away. Okay, it is gone. Now let's start lxd backup. That will re-import the pool. And now storage set. So let's use a new option and do zfs.export equals false. And stop lxd again. And what that should do is just prevent the export and keep the pool around. There we go. So that's really all that particular option does, but it works as expected. Now let's just launch a simple container. Oops. Okay. And storage volume list default set default A1. Let's see if I can set the new option directly on one of those. So let's do reserve space true. It's container A1. There we go. And then let's see config device override. So I'm gonna set effectively a limit on that container for its root device to say 10 gig. All right. So here we should be seeing the bad example. Config device. I've set a quota that's larger than the entire pool. So let me actually do that 2 gigs instead. Okay, now I've got 2 gigs. And what that should do is if I launch another container. So we saw that the total space was 4.4 gig, but now those 2 gigs should be effectively reserved for A1. Meaning that this one won't be able to actually use that space. Actually just do the ZFS. To show that this actually works, I need to go look at ZFS instead. Okay. So if I load up the container, this is not looking perfectly good. We do see the 2 gigs quota. We see the reservation, but the reservation is currently set to none. Okay, so it does look good. I wonder if the quota messed it up. Let's just try to flip that one back and forth. Okay, yeah, this time it's working. So I think the override caused some issues. I'll have to look into that. All right, so this one shows size 2.4, 2.4, okay. Sure, that's fine. Yeah, so the first one now shows exactly 2 gigs of size and currently available because the container is tiny. And the second one used to show 4.4 gig total size, and it shows 2.4 gig because of the 2 gig being reserved. Just something to keep in mind that, like, apparently currently we need to set that after the override, or there was some weird conflict there. You can also set it as a pool property, as always, by setting volume.zfs.reserve space to true directly on the pool, at which point it will apply to everything getting created from that point on. The last ZFS thing is the block size. I've not played with that one yet either, so I'm gonna be experimenting here. Let's see, I know 1K. And now if I go look at A1 again for config, yeah, there we go. Record size into 1K now. There are limits as far as how large you can go. I don't remember what it is, but yeah, there we go. Up to 16 megs. So you could make, well, just like this. This be power of 2, yeah. Hit meg. Be power of 2 from. Oh, okay. Right. And the way we had to do it is that we use the same config key for both the record size, which is the container side of things, and the block size, which is the VM side of things. And they don't have the same range of values. So for the VM side of things, it can go all the way to 16 megs, but for the container side of things, it can only go all the way to 1 meg. So that's what we're seeing here. So if I do 1 meg, now it works fine. If it was a VM, the same key, I would be able to go all the way to 16 meg, which is why we had two different errors. The first one was validated by lxd as being completely outside of the range valid, and the second one was validated by ZFS as far as for this dataset, it needs to be smaller. Anyway, that config is particularly useful for databases and those kind of workloads. So if you know that you're going to be performing always large writes, then increase your block size to line that up so that the copy and write mechanism within ZFS is as optimized as possible. The last thing to show is the snapshot schedule feature. So say we've got a snapshots.schedule hourly set on the default profile. So if I show now one of my instances and do expanded, we're gonna see the hourly schedule here. Now, if you wanted to clear that, in the past you just couldn't, because if you do this, all that it does is it clears the value from the instance inheriting from the profile. So it doesn't actually do you any good. But now you can do this instead. And that shows here that the schedule is not never, and that means it's not gonna get snapshotted anymore. So that's really all that it is, but it was a bit of an oversight we had, which has now been rectified. And that's it for everything in this release. I just noticed that I forgot to remove that web browser after the filtering points. So hopefully not too much of my screen was blocked off during the ZFS demo. But in any case, if you've got any question about this release or anything inside it, feel free to leave a comment in the section down below, or come talk to us on our community forum. We'll be very happy to help you. lxd 4.23 is currently being rolled out to Snap users. The progressive rollout has started just an hour ago or so, and at this rate should complete within 48 hours. So your systems will start automatically refreshing to 4.23. You can always kind of force refresh it if you want it earlier, but like we prefer to spread the load so that it doesn't really cause issues. Again, hope this was really useful, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.